Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. My name is Derek, and for the past 6 years, I have worked as a facilities maintenance supervisor for the Appalachian Mountain Club. Now, most people think my job involves fixing leaky faucets in visitor centers or replacing light bulbs in parking lot fixtures. And sure, that is part of what I do during the busy season when tourists flood the mountain lodges and campgrounds. But there is another side to my work that most people never hear about. And it is the part that has kept me awake more nights than I care to admit. The Appalachian Mountain Club operates dozens of backcountry shelters and huts scattered throughout the remote sections of the White Mountains in New Hampshire and western Maine. These are not the primitive three-walled lean-tos you might see on popular sections of the Appalachian Trail. I'm talking about full structures, some dating back to the early 1900s, built in locations so isolated that the only way to reach them is by hiking anywhere from 8 to 15 miles through rugged wilderness terrain. My job includes conducting seasonal inspections of these facilities, which means I spend a significant amount of time alone in places where cell service does not exist and the nearest other human being might be a full day's hike away. It was during one of these routine inspection trips that I experienced something I still cannot fully explain, something that fundamentally changed how I think about the wilderness and what might be living in the spaces between our maps and our understanding. The assignment seemed straightforward enough when it came across my desk in late October. I needed to perform the annual winter preparation inspection on the Zealand Falls hut, which sits at approximately 2,600 feet elevation in a remote section of the White Mountain National Forest. The hut had been closed to guests for 2 weeks already, and my job was to ensure all the winterization procedures had been properly completed before the first major snowfall sealed the area, off until spring. I started my hike in on a Thursday morning under overcast skies that threatened rain but had not yet delivered. The trail to Zealand Falls is well maintained during the hiking season, but by late October, the foot traffic has dropped to almost nothing. I passed maybe 3 other hikers during the entire 7-mile approach, and all of them were heading out, finishing their trips before the weather turned. By the time I reached the hut around 2 in the afternoon, I had the entire valley to myself. The Zealand Falls hut is a beautiful structure, I have to admit. It sits perched above a cascading waterfall with views across a valley that seems untouched by human presence. The building itself is solid construction, built to withstand the brutal mountain winters, with thick walls, heavy shutters, and a design that has kept it standing for nearly a century. I unlocked the main door and stepped inside, immediately noting the familiar smell of wood smoke and damp stone that characterizes these old mountain huts. My inspection routine is methodical and thorough. I check every window shutter to ensure proper sealing. I inspect the roof for damage. I verify that all food storage areas are completely empty and secured against animals. I test the structural integrity of bunks and stairs. I document everything with photographs and detailed notes that will be filed in our maintenance records. The process typically takes about 3 hours, and I had planned to spend the night in the hut before hiking out the next morning. Standard procedure, nothing unusual about it. I was about halfway through my inspection, working on the second-floor bunk room, when I heard the front door open downstairs. The sound was unmistakable, that heavy wooden door with its specific creak, followed by the distinctive thud of it closing. I called down immediately, identifying myself and explaining that the hut was closed for the season. No response came back, just silence. I figured it was probably another hiker who had not seen the closure notice, so I headed downstairs to politely redirect them. The main room was empty. The front door was closed and latched, exactly as I had left it. I checked the side entrance and the back door that leads to the kitchen area. Both were still secured from the inside. I was completely alone in the building, yet I had absolutely heard that door open and close. I stood there for a moment, listening to the absolute silence of the empty hut, and felt the first prickle of unease work its way up my spine. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe the building settling, or any number of rational explanations that happen in old structures. I've worked in these huts long enough to know they all have their quirks, their particular sounds and movements that can seem unsettling if you let your imagination run. I returned to my inspection work, but I would be lying if I said I was not more alert, more conscious of every sound around me. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident. I completed my inspection checklist, made my notes, and took my required photographs. As evening approached, I prepared a simple dinner using the camping stove I'd brought with me, since the hut's kitchen facilities were shut down for winter. I ate while sitting at one of the long dining tables, watching through the windows as darkness gradually filled the valley below. By 7 o'clock, full night had fallen, and I was completely isolated in this mountain hut with nothing but my flashlight and headlamp for illumination. I had just finished cleaning up from dinner when I heard footsteps on the second floor. Not the subtle creaking of wood settling or the random noises that old buildings make. I mean, distinct, clear footsteps. Someone walking from one end of the bunk room to the other, their weight making the floorboards creak in that rhythmic pattern that only comes from a person moving through space. I grabbed my flashlight and called out again, louder this time, demanding that whoever was up there identify themselves immediately. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of deep quiet that only exists in remote mountain locations far from any source of ambient noise. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness of the bunk room. The space was exactly as I had left it hours earlier. Empty bunks with their bare mattresses, my inspection notes on the small table by the window, my backpack in the corner where I had left it. No one was there. No one could be there. The room had only one entrance, the stairs I'd just climbed, and I would have seen anyone trying to leave. I checked every corner, looked under every bunk, examined every possible hiding spot. The room was empty. I stood there in the darkness, my flashlight beam moving slowly across the space, and tried to apply rational thinking to what I was experiencing. Old buildings make noise. Thermal expansion and contraction cause wood to shift. Wind can create sounds that seem like footsteps. I ran through every logical explanation I could think of, but none of them quite fit what I had heard. Those were footsteps, and some deep instinctive part of my brain knew it with absolute certainty. I made the decision to stay anyway. I'm not someone who scares easily, and I was not about to hike 7 miles through the darkness based on unexplained sounds in an old building. I set up my sleeping bag in the main room on the first floor, positioning myself where I had a clear view of both the front door and the stairs leading to the second level. I kept my flashlight within easy reach and tried to settle in for sleep, though I was far more alert than I would normally be. Sleep came eventually, sometime after midnight, but it was restless and broken by periods of waking to listen to the sounds of the hut around me. Around 3 in the morning, I woke fully to a sound that made my blood run cold. Someone was in the kitchen. I could hear the unmistakable sounds of cabinet doors opening and closing, of items being moved around, of someone conducting a methodical search through the kitchen space. The kitchen was separated from the main room by a doorway, and from my position I could see that the doorway was dark, no light coming from within. I got out of my sleeping bag as quietly as I could, grabbed my flashlight, and approached the kitchen entrance. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I reached the doorway, took a breath to steady myself, and swung my flashlight beam into the kitchen while simultaneously hitting the light switch for the overhead fixtures. Nothing happened. The overhead lights did not come on, which made sense since the power had been shut off for winter. But my flashlight showed an empty kitchen. Every cabinet door was closed, every surface was clear. The room looked exactly as it should, undisturbed and empty. But the sounds I had heard were not my imagination. I had been fully awake, alert, and those were absolutely the sounds of someone moving through the kitchen. I stood in the doorway for several minutes, my light moving across every surface, looking for any evidence that could explain what was happening. That is when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. On the counter next to the industrial sink was a coffee mug. It had not been there when I had done my inspection. I was certain of that because part of my checklist involved ensuring all dishes and utensils were properly stored. But there it was, a simple white ceramic mug sitting on the counter as if someone had just set it down. I approached the mug carefully, as if it might suddenly move or disappear. I reached out and touched it. The ceramic was cold, exactly the temperature you would expect in an unheated building in late October. But the mug had definitely not been there earlier. I picked it up, examined it, found nothing unusual about it except the fact of its existence. I set it back down and backed away from the kitchen, my mind racing through possibilities that all seemed impossible. I did not sleep again that night. I sat in my sleeping bag with my back against the wall and my flashlight in my hand, and I watched the darkness of the hut until dawn began to filter through the shuttered windows. As soon as there was enough light to navigate safely, I packed my gear and prepared to leave. I was done with my inspection anyway, and I saw no reason to spend another moment in that building. As I was doing a final check to ensure I had not left anything behind, I found something that made me question everything I thought I understood. On the table in the main room, right where I would see it as I prepared to leave, was a piece of paper. It was old, yellowed with age, and the handwriting on it was faded but still legible. The note was dated October 1983, more than 40 years earlier, and it read simply, "To whoever finds this, I stayed here alone one night during seasonal closure. I heard things I cannot explain. I saw someone who could not be here. If you are reading this, you have experienced it too. You are not crazy. This place is not empty when we think it is. Stay safe. Leave quickly." The note was not signed, but at the bottom was a rough sketch of the hut, with an X marking the location of the second-floor bunk room, the same room where I had heard those footsteps. I folded the note carefully and put it in my pocket. Then I locked the hut behind me and started the 7-mile hike out, moving faster than I normally would, driven by a need to put distance between myself and that place. When I returned to the main office, I filed my inspection report, noting that all winterization procedures had been properly completed, and the facility was secure for the season. I did not mention the sounds, or the mug, or the note. What would I say? That I think the hut is haunted? That someone or something was in there with me despite the physical impossibility? I kept those details to myself, but I did start quietly asking some of the other maintenance workers if they had ever experienced anything unusual during solo trips to the backcountry huts. What I learned during those careful conversations was disturbing. Nearly every worker who had spent time alone in the remote huts had experienced something they could not explain. Footsteps when no one else was present, doors opening and closing by themselves. The sensation of being watched, objects moved or appearing where they should not be. Everyone had their own stories, but no one talked about them openly because, well, who wants to be known as the person who believes in ghosts? One of the senior maintenance supervisors, a man named Tom who had been with the AMC for over 20 years, pulled me aside after I'd been asking around. He told me something that has stayed with me ever since. He said that the old mountain huts have histories we do not fully know, that people have lived and worked and died in those buildings over the course of nearly a century, and that some places just hold on to things that logic cannot explain. He told me that if I wanted to keep doing this work, I needed to accept that I would occasionally experience things that did not make sense, and that fighting against it or trying to rationalize everything would just drive me crazy. I have continued working for the AMC, and I have returned to Zealand Falls Hut several times since that October night. I have never experienced anything quite as intense as that first solo visit, but I would be lying if I said the place feels entirely normal to me now. There is always a sense of presence there, a feeling that you are sharing the space with something you cannot quite see or understand. I do my inspections quickly and efficiently, and I do not spend nights there alone anymore, unless absolutely necessary. The note I found that morning remains in my desk drawer at home. I have never shown it to anyone else, and I have never gone public with my experience. But I think about it sometimes, about the person who wrote that note back in 1983, about what they experienced that drove them to leave a warning for whoever came after them. And I think about how many other maintenance workers over the decades have had similar experiences, have felt that same presence, have heard those same impossible sounds in the darkness of an empty building. The wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains is vast and old and full of places where human presence has been minimal and temporary. We build our huts and our shelters, we mark our trails and draw our maps, and we tell ourselves that we understand and control these spaces. But there are things in those mountains that existed long before we arrived, and they will be there long after our buildings have crumbled and our trails have disappeared back into the forest. And sometimes, if you spend enough time alone in the remote places, you become aware of them, you feel their presence, and you realize that we are the visitors, not them. I still love my job, and I still find deep satisfaction in maintaining these historic mountain huts that provide shelter and safety for hikers exploring the White Mountain. But I approach that work differently now, with more humility and more respect for the spaces I'm moving through. And when I close up a hut for the winter and lock that heavy door behind me, I always say a quiet thank you to whatever presence might be listening, acknowledging that I was a guest in their space and grateful to be leaving unharmed. My name is Dr. Caroline Winters, and I have spent the better part of 15 years studying large predator behavior in the southern Appalachian Mountains. I hold a doctorate in wildlife ecology from the University of Tennessee, and my research has focused primarily on the re-establishment of black bear populations in areas where they were historically present but had been extirpated by human activity. My work involves extensive field work, often spending weeks at a time in remote wilderness areas conducting population surveys, setting up camera traps, and monitoring dean sites during winter months. I'm telling you this background not to impress you with credentials, but to establish that I'm a scientist trained in observation, documentation, and rational analysis. I'm not someone prone to flights of fancy or supernatural thinking. Everything I believe about the natural world is grounded in evidence and peer-reviewed research, which is why what I experienced during a solo research expedition in the Nantahala National Forest in western North Carolina has been so difficult for me to process and accept. The research project was focused on documenting black bear denning behavior in high-elevation areas of the Nantahala. I had identified a section of the forest that showed promising signs of bear activity based on preliminary surveys, and I needed to spend time in the area during late fall to locate and monitor den sites before the bears entered their winter dormancy. The location was extremely remote, accessible only by a combination of Forest Service roads that required a four-wheel drive vehicle and then approximately 9 miles of hiking on a trail system that saw minimal use outside of hunting season. I arrived at my research site on a Monday in early November. The weather forecast showed a week of relatively stable conditions, cold but dry, which was ideal for the work I needed to accomplish. I established my base camp in a small clearing beside a reliable spring, set up my tent and equipment, and began the process of systematically surveying the surrounding area for bear sign. The work was productive from the start. I found multiple trees showing evidence of bear marking behavior, several areas where bears had been foraging for fall mast crops, and most encouraging, I located what appeared to be a recently excavated den site on a north-facing slope about 2 miles from my camp. The first 3 days proceeded exactly as I had hoped. I documented den locations, set up several camera traps focused on travel corridors I had identified, and collected scat samples for dietary analysis. The area was showing all the signs of a healthy bear population, which was exactly what my research was designed to confirm. I was pleased with the data I was collecting and confident that this location would be valuable for long-term monitoring as part of the broader reintroduction success assessment. On the 4th night, something changed. I was in my tent reviewing the day's field notes by headlamp when I heard a vocalization that stopped me cold. It was coming from somewhere relatively close to my camp, maybe 100 yards away in the dense forest. The sound was unlike anything in my extensive experience with wildlife acoustics. It started as a low rumbling, almost subsonic, that I felt as much as heard. Then it rose in pitch and volume to become a prolonged howl that had elements of canid vocalization but was fundamentally different from any wolf or coyote I had ever heard. And then it ended with a series of sharp barking sounds that had an almost primate quality to them. I immediately began running through my mental catalog of known animal species in this region. Eastern coyotes can produce a wide range of vocalizations, but this was too low, too powerful. Black bears do vocalize, but this was nothing like the huffing, woofing, or bawling sounds bears make. There are no wolves in this part of North Carolina, and even if there were, this did not sound like any wolf vocalization I'd encountered in recordings or during my brief time studying gray wolves in Montana years earlier. I was listening to something I could not identify, which as a wildlife biologist with 15 years of field experience was deeply unsettling. I grabbed my audio recorder, which I keep running during field work to document any interesting wildlife encounters, and stepped outside my tent. The night was clear and cold, with enough moonlight to see the general shapes of trees and terrain features. I stood perfectly still, listening, waiting to see if the vocalization would repeat. After perhaps 2 minutes of silence, it came again, this time from a different location, maybe 70 yards to my left, the same pattern, low rumble, rising howl, sharp barks. And then I heard a response from yet another direction, behind my camp, maybe 100 yards away. Whatever these animals were, there were at least 2 of them, and they were communicating. I've spent hundreds of nights alone in wilderness areas, and I have encountered black bears, mountain lions, and countless other species that many people would find frightening. I've never felt the kind of primal fear that gripped me as I stood outside my tent, listening to those vocalizations moving around my camp. This was not the rational concern of a researcher observing potentially dangerous wildlife. This was something deeper, more instinctive, the kind of fear that comes from recognizing that you are in the presence of a predator that sees you as prey. The vocalizations continued for approximately 20 minutes, always moving, always surrounding my camp in a rough circle. I stood frozen, recording everything, documenting what I could not explain. Then they stopped. The silence that followed was absolute and somehow more terrifying than the sounds had been. I waited outside my tent for another 30 minutes, listening, hearing nothing but the normal sounds of the forest. Eventually, cold drove me back inside, where I sat fully dressed in my sleeping bag with my bear spray in one hand and my satellite communicator in the other, ready to trigger an emergency beacon if necessary. I did not sleep that night. I sat alert, listening to every sound, trying to apply scientific reasoning to what I had experienced. As dawn approached, I made a decision. I would pack up my camp and hike out to a location where I could get cell service and consult with colleagues about what I had heard. The research could wait. I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I spent another night in this location. But when I stepped outside my tent at first light, I found something that changed my decision. The area around my camp had been visited during the night. There were tracks everywhere, dozens of them, pressed into the soft earth around my tent. And these were not bear tracks. They were not canid tracks. They were not any tracks I recognized. They were approximately 14 inches long and 6 inches wide at the widest point, with 5 distinct toe impressions and what appeared to be the impression of a heel. They were vaguely humanoid in shape, but far too large to be human. And the depth of the impressions suggested whatever made them was extremely heavy, several 100 pounds at minimum. I photographed every track I could find. I took measurements. I made castings using the plaster of Paris I carry for exactly this purpose. I documented everything with the same rigorous methodology I would use for any other field observation. And then I sat down and tried to process what I was looking at. These tracks defied categorization. They were not from any known animal species in this region. The size and structure suggested a bipedal creature of immense weight and height. The placement and pattern of the tracks showed that whatever made them had walked in a complete circle around my tent, stopping at various points as if examining my camp. I am a scientist. I am trained to look for naturalistic explanations for observations, but I could not think of a single explanation that fit the evidence I was documenting. These were not bear tracks that happened to look unusual due to substrate conditions. They were not human tracks from some exceptionally large person wandering through the wilderness at night. They were something I had never encountered in 15 years of field research, something that should not exist according to our current understanding of wildlife in this region. I made the decision to stay. I needed more data. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I spent that day expanding my camera trap coverage, positioning cameras at different heights and angles around my camp and along the obvious travel routes I had identified from the tracks. I checked my audio recorder and confirmed that the previous night's vocalizations had been captured clearly. I prepared my camp for another night, but this time I was ready. I had documentation equipment positioned to capture anything that might approach. That second night, they returned. I was lying in my tent, fully dressed and alert, when I heard the first vocalization around 10 o'clock. Same pattern as before: low rumble, rising howl, sharp barks. This time I was recording with multiple devices, including a high-quality parabolic microphone pointed in the direction of the sound. The vocalizations moved around my camp again, and once again there were at least 2 distinct sources, possibly 3, communicating with each other in a pattern that suggested coordination and intelligence. But this time I saw them. I had my tent positioned so I could observe through the mesh window without being clearly visible from outside. The moonlight was bright enough to provide decent visibility, and I watched as a figure moved through the forest, approximately 50 yards from my tent. It was massive, at least 7.5 feet tall, with a body structure that was unmistakably bipedal, but far more robust than any human. It was covered in dark hair and moved with a fluid, powerful grace that suggested perfect familiarity with the terrain. It stopped at the edge of the clearing where my tent was positioned, and I watched as it turned its head in my direction. Even at that distance, I could see that the facial structure was unlike anything I had ever seen, neither fully human nor fully ape, something in between, or perhaps something entirely separate. We made eye contact. I'm certain of that. Whatever this creature was, it looked directly at me through the mesh of my tent window, and for perhaps 10 seconds we simply observed each other. I felt no sense of aggression or threat from it, just a kind of intense curiosity. And then it turned and moved back into the forest, its movement silent despite its size, and within seconds it had disappeared completely from view. I checked my cameras the next morning with hands that would not stop shaking. Multiple cameras had captured images and video of the creatures. 3 distinct individuals, varying slightly in size, but all sharing the same basic morphology. Bipedal, heavily built, covered in hair, moving with intelligence and purpose. The footage was clear, shot in good moonlight with high-quality equipment. There was no possibility of misidentification or mistake. I had documented creatures that should not exist. I spent another 2 days in that location, collecting more footage, more audio recordings, More track castings. The creatures returned each night, always maintaining a respectful distance, always observing but never approaching closer than 40 or 50 yards. On the third night, I conducted an experiment. I left a peace offering at the edge of the clearing, a bag of apples from my food supplies. By morning, the apples were gone, and in their place was something I still keep in my office. A perfectly constructed stack of stones, balanced with such precision that it could only have been created deliberately. When I finally hiked out with my evidence, I was faced with a decision that has defined the last 3 years of my life. Do I publish my findings? Do I share documentation of creatures that fundamentally challenge our understanding of wildlife in North America? Or do I keep silent and protect these beings from the inevitable human intrusion that would follow any public disclosure? I chose silence, mostly. I have shared my evidence with a small circle of trusted colleagues, other researchers who are studying similar phenomena. There is a quiet community of scientists who have encountered what we call unclassified primates in remote wilderness areas across North America, and we share information privately while publicly remaining silent. We do this not because we fear ridicule, though that is certainly a factor, but because we believe these creatures deserve protection, deserve to remain undisturbed in the few truly remote areas that still exist. I have returned to that location in the Nantahala forest many times since my initial encounter. I have never seen the creatures again, though I have found evidence of their presence. Tracks, tree markings, the occasional constructed arrangement of stones or sticks that shows clear intentionality. I believe they allowed me those 3 nights of observation as a kind of communication, showing themselves to make me aware of their existence and then withdrawing to maintain their privacy. My official research continues to focus on black bear populations, and my published work makes no mention of what I truly found during that November expedition. But I know what I saw, what I documented, what exists in the remote forests of the southern Appalachian Mountains. There are creatures living in these ancient forests that have managed to avoid sustained human contact through intelligence, caution, and the simple fact that vast areas of these mountains remain genuinely wild and unexplored. I am a scientist, and I believe in evidence and documentation. I have evidence that would change our understanding of biodiversity in North America, that would confirm what indigenous peoples have always known, that these mountains hold mysteries we have only begun to understand. But I also believe that some mysteries deserve protection, that not everything needs to be catalogued and studied and exposed to public view. Some beings deserve to remain in the shadows, living their lives unobserved and undisturbed by human intrusion. The tracks I cast that November morning sit in a locked cabinet in my office. The audio recordings are stored on encrypted drives. The video footage exists on a single hard drive that I keep in a safe deposit box. This evidence will remain private during my lifetime, but I've made arrangements for it to be donated to a research institution after my death, with instructions that it be handled with respect and consideration for the beings it documents. I still conduct fieldwork in remote Appalachian locations, and I still love the solitude and beauty of these ancient mountains. But I move through these forests differently now, with the awareness that I am not alone, that I am being observed by intelligences that have learned to remain hidden, and with gratitude that they allowed me, for 3 remarkable nights, to see them as they truly are. I have been volunteering with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy for almost 12 years now, which means I have spent more weekends than I can count, hiking into remote sections of the trail with tools and materials to maintain the footpath that stretches from Georgia to Maine. Trail maintenance is not glamorous work. We clear blowdowns, rebuild water bars, repair bog bridges, and repaint blazes. It is physically demanding and often thankless labor that happens largely out of sight of the thousands of hikers who use the trail each year. But it is deeply rewarding to know that your work helps keep this incredible resource accessible and safe. My name is Aaron, and my assigned section of trail covers approximately 8 miles in southwestern Virginia, a stretch that includes some of the most remote terrain on the entire Appalachian Trail. This section sees relatively light foot traffic compared to the more famous areas, and there are weeks during shoulder season when I might be the only person to walk that entire 8-mile stretch. I've always appreciated the solitude, the sense of being completely alone in vast wilderness, responsible for maintaining this narrow ribbon of trail that connects hikers to something larger than themselves. What happened to me during a routine maintenance trip in April of last year has made me question whether I'm ever truly alone on my section of trail, and whether the responsibility I feel for maintaining that path is appreciated by more than just human hikers. I had planned a 3-day maintenance trip to address winter damage and prepare the trail for the upcoming hiking season. The weather forecast looked ideal, and I was carrying a full pack of tools and supplies: bow saw, loppers, paint for blazes, materials for trail repair, plus my camping gear for 2 nights in the back country. The first day of work went exactly as planned. I cleared several large blowdowns, repaired erosion damage at multiple locations, and repainted blazes that had faded over the winter. I made camp that evening at a designated shelter about midway through my section, tired but satisfied with the progress I had made. I was the only person at the shelter, which was not unusual for this time of year on this remote section. I cooked dinner, hung my food bag properly, and settled in for the night in the 3-walled shelter that would be my home for the next 2 nights. I woke sometime after midnight to the sound of someone working on the trail. I could hear the unmistakable sounds of trail maintenance, the chunk of a Pulaski hitting wood, the scraping of a shovel, the crunch of gravel being moved and placed. The sounds were coming from maybe 100 yards north of the shelter, and my first thought was that another volunteer had arrived and was doing some night work, though that made no sense. No one does trail maintenance at night. It is dangerous work that requires good visibility. I grabbed my headlamp and stepped out of the shelter, calling out to whoever was working up the trail. The sounds stopped immediately. I called out again, identifying myself as a trail maintainer and asking if they needed any assistance. No response came back, just the deep silence of the forest at night. I stood there for several minutes listening, hearing nothing but normal night sounds. Eventually, I convinced myself that I had been hearing a bear or deer moving through the underbrush, sounds that in my half-asleep state I had misinterpreted as human activity. I returned to my sleeping bag and eventually fell back asleep. In the morning, I packed up and headed north to continue my maintenance work. About 100 yards from the shelter, exactly where I'd heard those sounds during the night, I found something that made me stop and stare. A section of trail that had been badly eroded and on my list to repair that day had been fixed. Someone had constructed a perfect stone staircase using rocks that had been carefully selected and placed to create stable, even steps up the eroded slope. The work was excellent, better than I could have done myself, and it must have taken hours to complete. The stones were still slightly damp with morning dew, but there were no footprints in the soft earth around the work site, no tool marks on the stones, no evidence of who had done this work or how they had managed it in the darkness. I documented everything with photographs, noting the location and the quality of the work. I was baffled, but also grateful. Someone had saved me hours of difficult labor. I assumed it must have been another volunteer from a different section who had come through and decided to help out, though the lack of any footprints or sign of their passage was strange. I continued my day's work, clearing more blowdowns and addressing other maintenance issues on my list. That second night, camping at the same shelter, the sounds returned. This time I was more alert, and I was certain of what I was hearing. Someone was working on the trail, and the work was happening south of my position this time, maybe 200 yards away. I could hear the rhythmic sounds of trail construction, digging, placing stones, tamping earth. I grabbed my headlamp and moved quickly toward the sounds, determined to catch whoever was doing this mysterious nighttime maintenance. But as I approached the area where the sounds were coming from, they stopped. I swept my headlamp across the trail and surrounding forest, calling out, receiving no response. I was alone. In the morning, I hiked south to see what I would find. Another section of trail that had been on my maintenance list was now perfectly repaired. A badly damaged water bar had been rebuilt with new stones and positioned at exactly the right angle to divert water off the trail. A section of bog bridge that I had planned to replace had been reinforced with fresh timber that looked like it had been milled specifically for the purpose. The work was immaculate, and it must have taken significant time and effort. Yet there was no sign of who had done it, no footprints, no tool marks, no evidence of human presence except the finished work itself. I spent that day completing my remaining maintenance tasks. But my mind was racing with questions. Who was doing this work? How were they accomplishing it without leaving any trace? Why were they doing it at night? And most puzzling, how were they managing to move heavy stones and timbers with such precision in complete darkness? I could not think of any explanation that made sense. That third night, I decided to stay awake and watch. I positioned myself outside the shelter with a clear view down the trail in both directions. I had my headlamp ready but kept it off, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The moon was only a thin crescent, so visibility was poor, but I was determined to see who was conducting these mysterious trail maintenance sessions. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the sounds begin again. This time, very close. Maybe only 50 yards south of my position. I could hear digging, the movement of stones, and what sounded like wood being shaped with a blade. I stood slowly, moving carefully toward the sounds, trying not to make any noise that might alert whoever was working. As I got closer, I began to see movement in the darkness. There were figures on the trail, multiple figures, working in coordinated silence. I could make out their shapes, but not their details. They were human-sized, but seemed to move in ways that were somehow wrong, too fluid, too quick. They were working together to move large stones that should have required mechanical advantage or multiple people to shift, but they handled them as if they weighed nothing. I watched, frozen in place, as they constructed a complex drainage system across the trail, arranging stones with perfect precision despite the darkness. I do not know how long I watched. Time seemed to lose meaning as I stood there observing work that should not be possible under these conditions. Then one of the figures stopped working and turned to face me directly. Even in the poor light, I could tell it had seen me, was aware of my presence. We stayed like that for several seconds, observer and observed, and then the figure raised one hand in what seemed unmistakably like a greeting or acknowledgement. And then all the figures simply melted back into the forest, moving silently and swiftly, and within seconds I was alone on the trail. I turned on my headlamp and examined the work they had been doing. It was perfect, a sophisticated drainage system that would keep water off the trail and prevent erosion for years. The stones were precisely placed, the angles calculated for maximum effectiveness. This was expert trail work, completed in maybe 30 minutes, work that should have taken me most of a day. I stood there in the beam of my headlamp, trying to process what I had just witnessed. In the morning, I packed up and hiked out. My maintenance work completed not by me but by mysterious helpers who worked in the darkness and left no trace except their excellent craftsmanship. I filed my regular maintenance report with the Conservancy, noting the sections of trail I had worked on, but I did not mention the overnight repairs. How could I? What would I say? That mysterious figures were maintaining my trail section at night, that I had witnessed impossible construction work in darkness. I kept silent and wondered if I had experienced something real or if isolation and exhaustion had created some kind of waking dream. But the work was real. The stone staircases, the water bars, The drainage systems, all of it remained solid and functional, evidence of skilled labor that I had not performed myself. Over the following months, I returned to my trail section regularly, and I found that the overnight maintenance continued. Every time I planned a trip, I would arrive to find that some of the work on my list had already been completed. Blowdowns cleared, blazes repainted, bridges repaired. Always excellent work, always done in ways that left no evidence of who had performed the labor. I began leaving small tokens of appreciation at my campsites. Simple things, energy bars, small bottles of water, a new paintbrush for blazing. By morning, these items would be gone, though I never saw who took them. I started thinking of my mysterious helpers as partners in the work, invisible collaborators who shared my commitment to maintaining this trail for the benefit of all who used it. I have asked around, carefully among other trail maintainers, trying to find out if anyone else has experienced similar phenomena. Most look at me like I'm crazy, but a few, usually the ones who have been doing this work for many years, get a knowing look in their eyes and change the subject quickly. I think I am not the only one who has encountered these helpers, but no one wants to talk about it openly. I do not know who or what these beings are. I do not know why they help maintain the trail, but I have come to believe that the Appalachian Trail, which follows ancient paths used by native peoples for thousands of years before European colonization, is more than just a recreational footpath. I think it follows routes that have always been significant, that connect places of power or importance in ways we do not fully understand. And I think there are beings who have always maintained these paths, who continue that work even now, and who occasionally allow themselves to be seen by those who respect the trail and the wilderness it passes through. I continue my volunteer work, but I approach it differently now. I leave offerings of gratitude. I speak quietly to the forest, thanking my unseen helpers for their partnership. And I maintain the trail with the awareness that I am participating in something older and more significant than I ever imagined when I first picked up trail tools 12 years ago. The Appalachian Trail is walked by millions, but it is maintained by more than just human volunteers, and for that I am profoundly grateful. If you're still listening, you probably enjoy stories like this. A like or a comment helps keep them alive. My name is Samantha Chen, and I'm a graduate student in the Department of Geosciences at Virginia Tech. My research focuses on karst topography and cave systems in the Appalachian region, specifically looking at how these underground networks formed and how they continue to evolve. The Appalachians are honeycombed with caves, many of them unexplored or only partially documented, and my thesis work involves surveying and mapping previously unknown systems to better understand the regional hydrology and geological history. Cave exploration is dangerous work. It requires specific training, proper equipment, and careful planning. You're entering environments where a single mistake can be fatal, where you might be squeezing through passages barely large enough to fit your body, where a flood could trap you miles underground with no possibility of escape. I have been caving for 6 years, and I am trained in vertical techniques, confined space rescue, and underground navigation. I take safety seriously, and I never explore alone. Except for once. That one exception nearly killed me and showed me something I still cannot explain. The cave system I was investigating was located in a remote section of the Jefferson National Forest in southwestern Virginia. It had been discovered by a local caver who had noticed a promising opening during a hiking trip and reported it to the regional grotto, the local chapter of the National Speleological Society. The entrance survey suggested it might connect to a known system several miles away, which would make it significant for understanding regional groundwater flow. I'd received permission to conduct an initial exploration and survey as part of my thesis research. I was supposed to go with 2 other cavers from the university grotto, but both cancelled at the last minute due to family emergencies and illness. I should have postponed the trip. Solo caving violates every safety protocol we follow, but I was facing a thesis deadline. The weather window was perfect, and the initial survey suggested this was a relatively straightforward system without major vertical drops or water hazards. I made the decision to go alone, taking extra safety precautions and leaving a detailed trip plan with my advisor, including the exact location, my planned route, and the time I expected to return. The entrance to the cave was located up a steep forested slope, hidden behind a rock fall that required some scrambling to access. The opening was small, maybe 3 feet high and 4 feet wide, but it opened into a larger passage beyond. I rigged my gear, checked my lights, had 3 independent sources as required, and entered the cave around 10 in the morning, giving myself 6 hours of exploration time before I needed to start heading out. The initial passages were beautiful, classic limestone cave formations with flowstone, stalactites, and small pools of crystal-clear water. I moved carefully, surveying as I went, taking measurements and photos, documenting everything for my thesis. The cave trended downward at a gentle angle, and I followed the main passage as it wound through the limestone, branching occasionally into side passages that I flagged for future exploration. About 2 hours in, I reached a section where the passage narrowed significantly. This is common in cave systems, and I am experienced with tight squeezes. This one was manageable, maybe 18 inches high, requiring me to remove my pack and push it ahead of me while I crawled on my belly through the restriction. I have done similar squeezes dozens of times. I pushed my pack through and then I started pulling myself forward, my helmet scraping the ceiling, my chest compressed against the limestone floor. Halfway through the squeeze, I became stuck. My hips had wedged against a narrowing in the passage that I had not properly assessed before committing. I could not move forward or backward. I was pinned in absolute darkness except for my headlamp, deep underground, completely alone, in a position where I could not get leverage to free myself. This is every caver's nightmare, and I felt panic rising in my chest, making it hard to breathe in the confined space. I forced myself to calm down. Panic kills in caves. I needed to think clearly and methodically. I focused on my breathing, taking slow, controlled breaths despite the pressure on my chest. I assessed my position carefully, feeling with my hands for any way to shift my body angle or find purchase to push or pull. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, I managed to exhale completely, collapsing my chest cavity enough to shift my hips slightly. That tiny movement gave me the angle I needed to push forward, and after several more minutes of careful maneuvering, I pulled myself through the restriction and into the larger passage beyond. I lay on the cave floor for several minutes, my heart hammering, my body shaking from the adrenaline dump. That was when I should have turned around and headed out. I had just experienced a serious safety incident, and continuing deeper into an unexplored system while solo was extremely poor judgment. But I was embarrassed by my panic, angry at myself for getting stuck in a relatively simple squeeze, and determined to complete at least the basic survey I had planned. So I made the second catastrophically bad decision of the day. I continued deeper into the cave. The passage beyond the squeeze opened into a larger chamber, maybe 30 feet across and 20 feet high. My lights revealed beautiful formations, and I spent time photographing and documenting the space. On the far side of the chamber, I found 3 possible continuation passages. I chose the middle one and continued my survey, moving steadily downward and inward, leaving flagging tape at intersections to mark my route out. I had been underground for approximately 4 hours when I reached what appeared to be a natural endpoint. A large chamber with a still pool of water and no obvious continuation passages. I was disappointed, having hoped to find a connection to the known system, but this appeared to be a dead end. I was preparing to turn around and begin my exit when I noticed something strange. On the far side of the pool, maybe 40 feet away, I could see what looked like light. Not the reflection of my own headlamp, but a distinct glow coming from somewhere beyond the pool. This made no sense. I was deep underground, far beyond any possibility of surface light penetrating. But the glow was undeniable, and it seemed to be coming from a passage or opening I'd not noticed before. I skirted around the edge of the pool, my curiosity overwhelming my better judgment. As I got closer, I could see that there was indeed a passage, low and wide, and the light was coming from somewhere beyond. The quality of the light was strange, not harsh like artificial lighting, but soft and diffuse, almost organic. I got down on my hands and knees and crawled into the passage, moving toward the light source. The passage opened into a chamber that should not exist. It was massive, at least 100 feet across, and so high that my lights could not reach the ceiling, and it was filled with bioluminescence. The walls, the ceiling, the formations, everything was covered with glowing organisms, creating a light show that was absolutely breathtaking. I had seen bioluminescent fungi in caves before, but never anything approaching this scale or intensity. The chamber glowed with a soft blue-green light that seemed almost supernatural in its beauty. I stood there in awe, documenting everything with my camera, trying to capture the incredible scene before me. And then I noticed the structures. Along the walls of the chamber were what appeared to be constructed formations, not natural cave features, but deliberately built structures. Stone walls arranged in geometric patterns, creating enclosures or rooms within the larger chamber. And on the walls of these structures were markings, symbols carved or painted onto the stone, clearly intentional and clearly ancient. I approached the nearest structure carefully, my mind racing with implications. If these were human constructions, they were significant archaeological finds, but they were deep underground in a chamber that showed no signs of regular human access. How had ancient peoples reached this location? Why had they built these structures? What purpose did they serve? I was examining the symbols, trying to photograph them clearly, when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Someone was moving in the chamber, and they were approaching my position. I spun around, my headlamp beam cutting through the bioluminescent glow, and saw a figure standing maybe 20 feet away. It was human-shaped, but wrong in ways I could not immediately process. Too tall, too thin, with proportions that were not quite right. And it was not wearing caving gear. It appeared to be dressed in clothing I could not identify, simple garments that seemed handmade, and it was barefoot on the stone floor of the cave. I called out, asking who they were, how they had gotten down here. The figure did not respond verbally, but it raised one hand and pointed toward one of the passages leading out of the chamber, a passage I had not noticed before. The gesture was clear. I needed to leave. The figure took a step toward me, and I backed away instinctively. It was not threatening exactly, but there was an intensity to its presence that terrified me in ways I could not explain. I did not need to be told twice. I moved quickly toward the passage where I had entered the chamber, crawling back through the low opening, feeling the figure's presence behind me, even though I could not see it. I reached the pool chamber and started moving quickly toward my exit route, following my flagging tape markers, no longer caring about survey measurements or documentation. I just needed to get out of that cave as quickly as possible. The trip out was a nightmare. I was moving too fast, making mistakes, scraping myself on rock as I rushed through passages. When I reached the tight squeeze where I had gotten stuck earlier, I forced myself to slow down and approach it carefully, knowing that panicking would only make it worse. I made it through without incident this time, but my relief was short-lived. I could hear movement behind me in the passage, the sound of someone or something following me through the cave. I do not remember much of the final section of the exit. I was operating on pure adrenaline and fear, my only thought to reach the surface and daylight. When I finally pulled myself out of the entrance opening and into the afternoon sunlight, I collapsed on the forest floor, gasping and shaking. I lay there for maybe 15 minutes before I could gather the strength to pack my gear and start the hike back to my vehicle. I filed my report with my advisor, describing the cave system in general terms and noting the significant bioluminescent chamber. I did not mention the structures or the figure I had seen. I knew I should report the archaeological features, but I also knew I would never go back to that cave. Whatever I had encountered down there, human or otherwise, had made it clear that I was not welcome. I have reviewed my photographs extensively. The images of the bioluminescent chamber are spectacular, and they clearly show the constructed structures and the symbols on the walls. I have shown these photos to several archaeologists, and they are baffled. The construction techniques and symbol systems do not match any known Native American culture from this region. The structures appear ancient, but their existence deep underground in a cave system with no obvious access route makes no sense. One archaeologist suggested they might be evidence of a previously unknown culture, something predating the known indigenous peoples of this region. But he had no explanation for how they could have been built or why anyone would create permanent structures deep underground. I completed my thesis using data from other cave systems. I never revealed the exact location of the cave I explored that day, and I have no plans to return or to guide others to it. Whatever exists in that underground chamber deserves to remain undisturbed, and whoever or whatever I encountered down there made their wishes clear. I was allowed to leave, but I was not welcome to stay or to return. I still do cave research, but I have become much more cautious, more respectful of the spaces I am entering. Caves are not just geological features. They are places with histories we do not understand, places that have been significant to humans and perhaps other beings for millennia. The Appalachian Mountains are ancient, and the cave systems that run through them may hold secrets that we are not meant to discover, spaces that belong to others and that we enter at our own risk. I think about that chamber sometimes, about the bioluminescent glow and the ancient structures and the figure that stood in the darkness and pointed me toward the exit. I wonder who they were, what they were protecting, and how many other caves in these mountains hold similar secrets, hidden in chambers that humans rarely see, guarded by presences that have existed in the darkness since long before our ancestors first explored these mountains. I took a summer internship with the U.S. Forest Service because I thought it would look good on my resume and because I love the outdoors. I was 22 years old, between my junior and senior years at the University of Georgia studying environmental science, and I thought spending 3 months working in the Chattahoochee National Forest in northern Georgia would be the perfect way to gain practical experience while enjoying the mountains. The job description was vague but appealing. Assist with forest inventory surveys, participate in fire danger assessment, support recreation management, and help with various conservation projects as needed. My name is Marcus, and I'm not someone who scares easily. I grew up camping and hiking. I've spent plenty of time alone in the woods. I consider myself practical and rational, not prone to supernatural thinking or paranoid imagination, which is why what happened during my internship has been so difficult to process, and why I've spent the last 3 years trying to forget those 2 weeks in August when I was assigned to a fire lookout tower in one of the most remote sections of the forest. Fire lookouts are a tradition dating back over a century in American forestry. They are towers, usually between 30 and 100 feet tall, topped with a small cabin where an observer lives during fire season, scanning the forest for signs of smoke and reporting any potential fires. Most lookouts have been decommissioned as aerial surveillance and satellite technology have made them obsolete, but some are still manned in high-risk areas or maintained as historic structures. The tower I was assigned to was one of the latter, a 70-foot structure built in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, located on a mountain peak approximately 15 miles from the nearest road. The assignment was presented as a unique opportunity. I would spend 2 weeks alone at the tower, conducting daily fire danger assessments and forest observations, maintaining the historic structure, and experiencing a type of forest work that few people get to do anymore. I would be resupplied once at the midway point, and I would have a radio for emergency contact, though cell phone coverage was non-existent in that area. It sounded like an adventure, a chance to test my self-reliance and enjoy complete solitude in a beautiful location. I hiked in on a Monday morning in mid-August, carrying everything I would need for the first week: food, water filters, clothing, and supplies. The tower was exactly as described, a tall wooden structure that creaked in the wind, with a small cabin at the top, maybe 12 feet square, with windows on all sides providing 360-degree views of the surrounding forest. The cabin was furnished with a bed, a small table and chair, a propane stove for cooking, and the firefighting equipment: maps, an Osborne firefinder, binoculars, and a radio for reporting any smoke sightings. The first few days were exactly what I had hoped for. The solitude was complete and peaceful. I would wake at dawn, scan the horizon for smoke, document weather conditions, and spend my days reading, writing in my journal, and enjoying the incredible views. The sunsets were spectacular, and the night sky, free from any light pollution, showed more stars than I had ever seen. I felt lucky to have this experience, this chance to disconnect completely from the modern world and live simply in a tower above the forest. On the fourth night, I had the first dream. It was vivid and unsettling enough that I woke around 3 a.m. with my heart racing. In the dream, I was climbing down from the tower in complete darkness, moving through the forest below, walking for what felt like hours. I was searching for something, but I did not know what. And then I reached a clearing where there were others, dozens of people standing in a circle, all of them silent and still, and they turned to look at me as I entered the clearing. And then I woke up. I dismissed it as just a strange dream, probably influenced by the isolations and the constant background creaking of the tower swaying gently in the wind. But the next night, the dream returned, almost identical. I was climbing down in darkness, walking through the forest, reaching that clearing with the silent figures. This time they moved closer, surrounding me, and I could see that their faces were wrong somehow. Human, but not quite right, with expressions that showed no emotion. I woke again, disturbed and unrested. By the 6th day, I was not sleeping well. The dreams were occurring every night, becoming more intense and more disturbing. And I was starting to notice things while awake that made me uneasy. I would find my boots positioned differently than I had left them. Small items in the cabin would be moved. My journal had been opened to a different page than where I had left it. I started to wonder if I was sleepwalking, moving around the cabin during the night without conscious awareness. On the 7th night, I decided to test this theory. Before going to bed, I carefully arranged objects in the cabin in specific positions that I would remember. I placed my boots side by side, toes facing the door. I put my flashlight on the left side of the table, parallel to the edge. I left my journal closed with a pen placed perpendicular across it. If I moved these items during sleep, I would know I was sleepwalking. I woke at my usual 3 a.m. from the recurring dream. I lay in bed for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness, and then I looked around the cabin. My boots were now at opposite corners of the small room. The flashlight was on the floor beneath the table. The journal was open to a page where I'd written nothing, and there were marks on the page, symbols I did not recognize, drawn in what appeared to be my handwriting. I sat up, my skin crawling, and turned on my headlamp. Everything I was seeing was real, not another dream. Something or someone was moving objects in the cabin while I slept, and they were writing in my journal. I spent the rest of that night sitting in the chair by the windows, my headlamp on, watching the forest below and listening to the sounds of the tower creaking in the wind. As dawn approached, I decided I needed to radio for early extraction. This assignment had gone from peaceful solitude to something I could not explain or handle alone. But when I picked up the radio handset and tried to call, I got only static. I tried different channels, checked the connections, verified that the radio had power. Everything appeared to be functioning, but I could not establish contact with anyone. I was completely isolated. The 8th day passed slowly. I was exhausted from lack of sleep, stressed by the malfunctioning radio, and increasingly certain that something was very wrong. I did not trust the cabin anymore, did not feel safe sleeping there. As evening approached, I made a decision. I would spend the night on the observation deck outside the cabin, where I could see anything approaching the tower. It would be uncomfortable, but I would feel safer being able to see my surroundings. I settled on the deck wrapped in my sleeping bag, my back against the cabin wall, watching the sunset turn the forest gold and red. As darkness fell, I kept my headlamp on, scanning the forest below periodically, seeing nothing but trees and shadows. I must have dozed off briefly, because I woke with a start to find it was full night and my headlamp had been turned off. I reached for it with shaking hands and turned it back on, and that is when I saw them. There were figures on the observation deck with me, 3 of them standing at the railing looking out over the forest. They were human-shaped but indistinct, as if I was seeing them through fog even though the night was clear. They did not acknowledge my presence, did not turn to look at me, just stood there silently gazing out at the darkness. I was frozen, unable to move or speak, my headlamp beam shining right through them as if they were only partially present. I watched them for what might have been seconds or minutes, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. And then they turned in unison and walked toward the cabin door, passing through the closed door as if it was not there. I sat alone on the deck, shaking, my rational mind trying to find an explanation for what I had just witnessed. Exhaustion-induced hallucinations, some kind of waking dream. I had no idea, but I knew I could not stay on that tower another night. As soon as there was enough light to see, I packed my essential gear and started down the tower ladder. I was abandoning the assignment, breaking my commitment, but I didn't care. I needed to get away from that place. The climb down seemed to take forever, and when I finally reached the ground, I felt the first measure of relief I'd experienced in days. But as I started hiking toward the trail that would take me out of this area, I realized something was wrong. The trail was gone. The clearly marked path that I had hiked in on was simply not there anymore. I was standing where it should be, but there was no evidence of a trail, just unbroken forest in all directions. I spent hours trying to navigate out using my compass and basic orienteering, but nothing made sense. I should have been moving toward the service road where I had been dropped off, but I never seemed to get closer. I would walk for what felt like miles, and then I would recognize a tree or a rock formation that I had already passed. I was walking in circles, even though my compass showed I was traveling in a consistent direction. As the sun began to set on my 8th day, I was forced to admit that I was lost, that I was not getting out before nightfall, and that I would have to spend another night in this forest. I made a simple camp, built a fire more for psychological comfort than warmth, and sat awake through the night. The dreams had followed me out of the tower. I would close my eyes for a moment and immediately find myself walking through the forest in my dream state, always moving toward that clearing with the silent figures. And each time I would force myself awake, snapping back to consciousness beside my fire. I do not know how I finally found my way out. The next morning I started walking again, choosing a direction at random, and after several hours I stumbled onto a Forest Service road. I followed it for miles until I reached a ranger station where I was able to get help. The rangers were concerned about my condition. I was dehydrated, exhausted, and according to them, incoherent. They said I kept talking about the tower and the figures and the dreams. They treated me for exposure and dehydration and contacted my supervisor. The official story is that I experienced a psychological break brought on by isolation and stress. that I abandoned my post and got lost due to impaired judgment. My internship was terminated early, and I was sent home with a recommendation for counseling. The Forest Service conducted an investigation and determined that the radio equipment at the tower had been functioning properly the entire time, that my reports of malfunction were likely part of my psychological episode. But I have the journal pages. Before I left that tower, I photographed every page of my journal, including the pages with symbols I do not remember drawing. I have shown these symbols to people with various areas of expertise, and no one can identify them or explain them. They do not match any known writing system or symbolic language. They are simply marks made in my handwriting during nights when I have no memory of being awake. I completed my degree, but I did not pursue a career in forestry or environmental science. I work in an office now, in a city, and I do not camp or hike anymore. I have no desire to spend time in forests, no interest in solitude or wilderness. Because I know what I experienced was real, that something in that remote section of the Chattahoochee National Forest interacts with people who spend time alone there, and that it affected me in ways I still do not fully understand. The fire lookout tower still stands. I have checked periodically online and found that it has been designated a historic structure but is no longer manned or used for active fire monitoring. I wonder sometimes if other people have spent time there, if they have experienced the dreams and the figures and the impossible navigation. I wonder if the Forest Service knows about the tower's history and whether my experience was unique or part of a pattern they choose not to acknowledge. I have no plans to ever return to that area, and I strongly advise anyone reading this to stay away from remote fire lookouts in the Appalachian forests. Some places of solitude are better left unoccupied, and some towers above the forest are observation posts for more than just fire and smoke. They are places where the boundaries between our reality and something else grow thin, where consciousness itself becomes unreliable, and where spending too much time alone can invite presences that should remain undisturbed. I have been working as a professional backpacking guide for almost 10 years, which means I have led hundreds of trips into wilderness areas across the eastern United States. My company specializes in multi-day guided expeditions for people who want to experience genuine wilderness but lack the skills or confidence to go alone. We handle everything from gear rental to meal planning to navigation, allowing clients to enjoy backcountry experiences while having an expert handle the logistics and safety considerations. My name is Jennifer, and I love my job. There is something deeply rewarding about introducing people to wilderness, watching them discover capabilities they did not know they had, seeing their confidence grow as they realize they can thrive in environments that initially seemed intimidating. I've guided everyone from corporate executives looking for adventure to families wanting to reconnect away from technology to individuals dealing with personal challenges who find healing in the simplicity of life on the trail. The trip I'm about to describe was supposed to be routine. A 4-day backpacking trip in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia with a group of 6 clients. The route I had planned was one I'd led many times before, a loop trail that covered approximately 35 miles through beautiful and moderately challenging terrain. The clients were all experienced hikers, physically fit and properly prepared. This should have been an easy trip by my professional standards, enjoyable and uneventful. We started the trip on a Wednesday morning, and the first day went exactly as planned. We covered about 9 miles, made camp at a designated site, and everyone was in good spirits. I conducted my usual evening briefing, reviewing the next day's route and discussing leave no trace principles and answering questions. The group dynamics were excellent, everyone getting along well, and I felt confident this would be one of those perfect trips that makes my job feel effortless. On the second night, we were camped beside a small creek in a valley surrounded by ridges thick with hardwood forest. I woke around midnight to the sound of someone moving around the campsite. As the guide, it was my responsibility to be aware of everything happening, so I unzipped my tent and looked out to see who was up. One of my clients, a woman named Rebecca, was standing at the edge of our camp, facing the forest, completely motionless. I called her name softly, not wanting to startle her. She did not respond. I called again, louder, and she remained motionless. I got out of my tent and approached her carefully. As I got closer, I could see that her eyes were open, but she seemed to be in some kind of trance state, aware but not responsive. I had dealt with sleepwalking clients before, and I knew the protocol. Gently redirect them back to their tent without fully waking them. But when I touched Rebecca's shoulder to guide her back, she spoke in a voice that did not sound like her own, deeper and more resonant. She said, "They are calling council in the old place. We have to go." Before I could respond, another client emerged from his tent, a man named David, and he walked directly to stand beside Rebecca, assuming the same motionless stance, staring into the forest. And then another client joined them, and another, until 4 of my 6 clients were standing in a line at the edge of camp, all in that same trance state, all facing the same direction into the dark forest. The 2 remaining clients were awake now and emerging from their tents, looking as confused and frightened as I felt. I tried talking to the 4 entranced clients, calling their names, asking them to respond. Nothing worked. They just stood there, silent and still except for their breathing. I had no idea what was happening or how to handle it. This was completely outside any scenario covered in my wilderness guide training. I was considering whether to trigger my emergency beacon when the 4 clients simultaneously started walking into the forest, moving together in a group, coordinated in their movements despite the darkness and the rough terrain. I made a split-second decision. I could not let them go into the forest alone in this condition. I grabbed my headlamp and followed them, calling back to the 2 conscious clients to stay at camp and that I would bring the others back. I followed the 4 entranced clients as they moved through the forest with unsettling confidence, never stumbling or hesitating, even though they were navigating in darkness through difficult terrain. They moved as if following a specific route, and I struggled to keep up while trying to mark our path so I could lead everyone back to camp. After maybe 20 minutes of hiking, we reached a clearing I had never seen before, despite having led trips through this area multiple times. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 50 feet across, and it was dominated by a rock formation at its center, flat stones arranged in what appeared to be a deliberately constructed pattern. The 4 clients walked directly to this formation and sat down around it, forming a circle, their hands placed on the stones, and then they started speaking in unison, words I did not recognize in a language I'd never heard. I stood at the edge of the clearing, my headlamp illuminating this impossible scene, trying to decide what to do. Should I try to physically remove them from the circle? Should I let whatever was happening run its course? Should I go back for the other clients and safety equipment? Before I could decide, I saw movement at the far edge of the clearing. Figures were emerging from the forest, multiple figures. Approaching the rock formation where my clients sat, the figures were humanoid, but not quite human. They moved with a fluid grace that seemed unnatural, and their proportions were slightly wrong in ways that made my brain refuse to fully process what I was seeing. They approached the circle where my clients sat, and they took position, standing behind each seated person, placing their hands on my client's shoulders. The chanting grew louder, more intense, and I felt something shift in the air of the clearing, a pressure or presence that made my skin crawl and my instincts scream at me to run. I do not know how long I stood there watching this scene. Time seemed to lose meaning in that clearing, but eventually the chanting stopped. The figures withdrew back into the forest, moving silently and swiftly until they had disappeared. and my 4 clients stood up, looked around as if waking from sleep, and one of them, Rebecca, saw me and said in her normal voice, "Jennifer, why are we out here? I was sleeping in my tent." None of them had any memory of waking, of walking to the clearing, of the chanting or the figures. They remembered going to sleep at camp and then suddenly being here with me, confused about how they had gotten here. I made the decision not to explain what I had witnessed. Not yet. I simply told them they had been sleepwalking, that I had followed them to keep them safe, and that we needed to get back to camp immediately. I used my marked route to navigate us back, and we reached camp just as dawn was breaking. The 2 clients who had stayed at camp were relieved to see us return, and I made up a story about everyone having had a shared sleepwalking episode, possibly triggered by something in the food or water. It sounded ridiculous even to me, but I needed some explanation that would not terrify everyone. I suggested we end the trip early and hike out that morning, citing concerns about the mysterious sleepwalking incident. Everyone agreed readily, clearly unsettled by the experience, even if they did not remember most of it. We hiked out that day, and I reported to my company that the trip had been cut short due to illness in the group. I did not mention the clearing, or the figures, or the chanting. How could I? What would I say? That my clients had been possessed or controlled by something in the forest? That I had witnessed beings that should not exist conducting some kind of ritual with my group? I had no explanation that would make sense to anyone who had not been there. I struggled with what I had seen for weeks after that trip. I considered whether I had hallucinated the figures, whether exhaustion and stress had caused me to see things that were not there. But I could not convince myself that I had imagined it. The experience had been too vivid, too real. And my clients, while they had no memory of the clearing or the ritual, all reported having intensely vivid dreams that night, dreams of ancient forests and gatherings of people who spoke in unknown languages. I researched the area where we had been camping, looking for any historical or archaeological significance that might explain what I had witnessed. What I found was disturbing. The valley where we had camped was mentioned in several accounts from early European settlers, describing it as a place native peoples avoided, a location they considered sacred or forbidden. There were references to councils held in the old places, where spirits and humans met to maintain balance between worlds. I returned to that area once more, without clients, to try to find the clearing again. I spent 2 days searching the forest, covering every possible route from our campsite, and I never found it. The clearing with the rock formation simply was not there, or I could not find the way back to it. I eventually gave up, accepting that some places only reveal themselves under specific circumstances, that some spaces exist at the intersection of our reality and something else, and that access to them is not within our control. I've continued working as a backpacking guide, but I avoid that section of the Monongahela National Forest now. I route my trips around that valley, choosing slightly longer or more difficult paths to stay away from that area. I've never told anyone the full story of what I witnessed that night, not my company, not my colleagues, not the clients who were involved. But I carry it with me, the memory of that clearing and those figures, and the knowledge that there are presences in the Appalachian forests that interact with humans in ways we do not understand. The mountains are old, far older than our civilization, and they hold memories and presences from times before we existed. When we walk through these forests, we are moving through spaces that belong to others, that have their own purposes and histories independent of human presence. Most of the time, we are simply passing through, noticed but not interfered with. But occasionally, for reasons I cannot explain, we are drawn into something larger, something ancient, and we become participants in rituals and gatherings that connect to a past we have forgotten. If you spend enough time in deep wilderness, you will eventually experience things that do not fit into your normal understanding of reality. You can choose to rationalize them, to explain them away, to convince yourself that you hallucinated or misunderstood. Or you can accept them, acknowledge that the world is stranger and more complex than we like to believe, and continue moving through these spaces with respect and humility. I have chosen the latter path, and it has changed how I experience wilderness, how I guide others through it, and how I think about our place in landscapes that existed long before humans arrived and will exist long after we are gone. I work as a conservation officer for the state of Tennessee, which means my job involves enforcing hunting and fishing regulations, investigating wildlife crimes, and patrolling vast areas of public land to ensure people are following the rules and that natural resources are protected. It is a job that requires you to spend significant time alone in remote areas, often at night, often in weather conditions that keep everyone else indoors. I carry a badge and a firearm, and I have arrest authority within my jurisdiction. My name is Thomas Bradley, and I have been doing this work for 14 years. I have seen a lot in that time. I have arrested poachers, investigated illegal logging operations, rescued lost hikers, and dealt with every kind of human stupidity and criminal behavior you can imagine. I have confronted armed suspects in the middle of nowhere, tracked criminals through difficult terrain, and put myself in dangerous situations, because that is what the job requires. I am not someone who scares easily, and I have always believed that the most dangerous thing in any forest is a criminal human, not any animal or supernatural threat. What happened to me during a routine patrol in the Cherokee National Forest changed that belief, and showed me that there are things in the Tennessee wilderness that law enforcement training does not prepare you for, and that human authority means nothing to. It was a cold night in early February, and I was conducting a patrol in a section of the forest where we had received reports of illegal night hunting. Night hunting of deer is a serious wildlife violation, and we take it seriously because it is both dangerous and devastating to game populations. I had positioned my vehicle on a Forest Service road and was patrolling on foot through an area where spotlighting had been reported. Spotlighting is a technique where poachers use powerful lights to illuminate and temporarily blind deer, making them easy targets for shooting. It is cowardly, unsportsmanlike, and illegal, and catching the people who do it is one of the satisfying parts of my job. I was moving quietly through the forest, watching for any sign of artificial light or listening for gunshots, when I heard something that made me stop and listen more carefully. It was not a gunshot. It was a vocalization, and it was unlike anything I had heard in over a decade of working in these forests. It started as a low rumbling that I felt more than heard, a subsonic frequency that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Then it rose in pitch to become a prolonged scream, high-pitched and piercing, that echoed through the valley. And then it cut off abruptly, leaving a silence that seemed unnatural in its completeness. I have heard bobcats screaming, which can sound disturbingly human. I have heard owls, coyotes, and every other vocal species native to Tennessee. This was none of those. The volume and power suggested something large, and the complexity of the vocalization suggested intelligence. I stood completely still, my hand instinctively moving to my sidearm, listening and watching for any sign of what had made that sound. The vocalization came again, this time from a different location, maybe 200 yards to my left. It was the same pattern, rumble building to scream, and it was clearly a communication. Something was signaling across the valley, and it was being answered. I heard a responding call from yet another direction, and then another, until I counted at least 4 distinct sources surrounding my position. Whatever these animals were, they were coordinating, and I was in the middle of their territory. Professional responsibility dictated that I investigate, that I try to identify what I was hearing and document it properly, but every instinct I had was telling me to get back to my vehicle and leave this area immediately. I have learned to trust my instincts during 14 years of law enforcement work, and they had never been louder or more insistent than they were at that moment. I started moving back toward my vehicle. Not running, but walking quickly and purposefully, trying to maintain awareness of my surroundings while covering distance. I'd gone maybe 100 yards when I realized I was being followed. I could hear movement paralleling my path, staying in the tree line maybe 40 yards to my right. Whatever was following me was large and moving with deliberate care, timing its movement to my footsteps to mask the sound. I stopped, and the following movement stopped. I moved, and it moved. This was predatory behavior, the kind of stalking that big cats use, but no mountain lion in Tennessee is large enough to make the sounds I'd heard or to show this level of bold interest in an adult human. I turned my spotlight on, a powerful handheld unit that law enforcement uses for night operations, and swept it toward where I estimated my follower was located. The beam caught something and I froze. Two eyes reflected back at me, bright yellow-green in the spotlight beam, positioned approximately 7 feet off the ground. The eyes were large, much larger than a deer or any animal I would expect to encounter. I held the beam steady, trying to see more detail, but the reflective eye shine was all I could make out through the dense forest vegetation. We stayed like that for several seconds, observer and observed, and then the eyes moved. Whatever it was, stepped sideways behind a tree and disappeared from view. I swept my spotlight across the area, trying to relocate it, seeing nothing. But I could feel it watching me, could sense its presence with a certainty that bypassed rational thought. I started moving again, faster now. Abandoning any pretense of quiet patrol, just focused on reaching my vehicle. The following continued, but now there were multiple sources. I could hear movement on both sides of my position, coordinated and deliberate. Whatever these animals were, they were working together to track me. I was being herded, guided along a specific route, and I realized with growing alarm that they were steering me away from my vehicle, angling me deeper into the forest rather than toward the road where I had parked. I stopped and changed direction, turning 90 degrees to try to break out of the pattern they were establishing. Immediately, the following movement became more aggressive. I heard something large moving quickly through the underbrush, closing distance, and I spun around with my spotlight to see a massive figure perhaps 40 yards away. Standing upright on 2 legs, far too large to be a human. It was there for just a second in my light beam, and then it dropped down and moved behind cover so quickly that I questioned whether I had really seen it. But I had seen it. Whatever these creatures were, they were bipedal, enormous, and intelligent enough to use coordinated tactics to control my movement. I was being hunted by something that should not exist, and my sidearm and badge meant absolutely nothing in this situation. I made the decision to run. I oriented myself toward where I knew the road must be, even though that meant moving directly against the direction they were trying to push me, and I ran as fast as the terrain and darkness would allow. The chase was terrifying. I could hear them moving with me, staying parallel, occasionally crashing through undergrowth close enough that I knew they could close the distance anytime they wanted. They were not trying to catch me. They were driving me, testing me, playing with me in the way predators sometimes toy with prey before making a kill. I burst out of the tree line onto the Forest Service road maybe half a mile from where I had parked, my lungs burning, my legs shaking from exertion and adrenaline. I could see my vehicle in the distance, and I sprinted toward it, expecting at any moment to feel something grab me from behind. I reached my vehicle, threw myself inside, and locked the doors. I sat there with the engine running, my spotlight aimed back at the tree line, watching for any sign of pursuit. What I saw in that spotlight beam will stay with me for the rest of my life. 3 figures emerged from the forest and stood at the edge of the road, approximately 30 yards from my vehicle. They were massive, between 7 and 8 feet tall, heavily built, covered in dark hair. They stood upright, like humans, but with proportions that were clearly not human. Broader shoulders, longer arms, heads that seemed to sit directly on those shoulders without visible necks. They stood side by side, watching my vehicle, making no move to approach, but also making no move to leave. They were allowing me to see them, showing themselves clearly and deliberately, and the message was unmistakable. This is our territory. You are here at our sufferance. Leave now." I left. I put my vehicle in gear and drove out of that area without looking back. I radioed dispatch and reported that I was ending my patrol due to encountering an aggressive animal, intentionally vague about the details. I drove back to the office, wrote a brief incident report noting an encounter with an unidentified large animal, and went home, where I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling and trying to process what had happened. In the following days, I debated whether to file a detailed report describing exactly what I had seen. I knew it would affect my credibility, possibly my career. Conservation officers who report Bigfoot sightings are not taken seriously, even when those reports come from trained law enforcement professionals with years of experience. But I also felt an obligation to document what I had encountered, to warn other officers who might patrol that area, to contribute to whatever record might exist of these creatures and their presence in Tennessee forests. I ended up filing a supplemental report that was more detailed, describing the vocalizations, the stalking behavior, and the clear sighting of 3 large bipedal animals. I included my assessment that these animals showed coordinated hunting behavior, territorial awareness, and intelligence that exceeded any known wildlife species in the region. The report was received by my supervisor, acknowledged, and filed away. No investigation was conducted. No follow-up occurred. I got the distinct impression that my report was not the first of its kind, that other officers had encountered similar things, and that there was an unspoken policy of documenting such reports, but not acting on them or publicizing them. I have continued working as a conservation officer, but I approach my job differently now. I'm more cautious in remote areas, especially at night. I pay attention to vocalizations I cannot immediately identify, and I trust my instincts when they tell me to leave an area, even if I cannot explain the feeling rationally. I have spoken quietly with other officers, and I have learned that encounters like mine are not as rare as you might think. Many officers have experienced things they cannot explain, have seen animals that should not exist, have felt presences in the forest that go beyond anything covered in wildlife management textbooks. There is a quiet understanding among those of us who spend significant time in deep wilderness. The forests of Appalachia are older and stranger than the general public realizes, and there are things living in remote areas that have successfully avoided sustained human contact for reasons we can only guess at. Whether these are remnant populations of unknown primate species, whether they are something else entirely, or whether they exist in some space between our understanding and something beyond it, I cannot say. But I know what I saw, what I experienced, and I know that human authority and law enforcement powers mean nothing when you encounter beings that have existed in these mountains since long before our laws were written. I still patrol the Cherokee National Forest, still enforce hunting and fishing regulations, still investigate wildlife crimes, but I avoid that particular section where I was chased and hunted, and when I work at night in remote areas, I am always aware that I might not be the apex predator, that there are presences in these forests that dwarf human authority, and that we exist in their territory only because they allow it. My name is Dr. Rebecca Hartwell, and I am an ecological surveyor specializing in forest health assessment and invasive species documentation. I work as an independent consultant for various state and federal agencies, conducting detailed surveys of forest ecosystems to assess biodiversity, identify disease or pest problems, and document the presence and spread of non-native species that threaten native ecosystems. My work requires extensive solo time in forests, often in areas that see no other human traffic, as I conduct systematic surveys that can take weeks to complete properly. I have a doctorate in forest ecology from NC State University, and I have been conducting field surveys for almost 20 years. I am rigorous in my methodology, careful in my documentation, and skeptical by nature and training. Everything I believe about ecosystems is grounded in peer-reviewed science and empirical evidence, which is why what I documented during a 6-week survey in the Pisgah National Forest in western North Carolina has challenged every assumption I held about what we know and do not know about the ecology of Appalachian forests. The project was a comprehensive survey of a remote watershed that had been designated for potential wilderness area status. The Forest Service needed detailed baseline ecological data to support the wilderness designation, and I had been contracted to provide that documentation. The survey area covered approximately 25 square miles of forest in a drainage basin that had seen minimal human impact since the early 1900s. It was ideal habitat for my work, diverse, intact, and accessible enough to conduct the survey, but remote enough that I would be working in essentially pristine conditions. I established a base camp in late May and began the systematic survey process that would occupy my entire summer. The work is methodical and time-consuming. I established transect lines across the survey area, document every plant species I encounter, note evidence of wildlife, collect soil samples, photograph significant findings, and record everything in both written and digital formats. It is solitary work, but I find it meditative and deeply satisfying to document ecosystems in such detail. During the first 3 weeks, the survey proceeded normally. I was documenting expected species compositions, healthy forest conditions, and no significant invasive species problems. The wildlife sign indicated healthy populations of deer, black bear, turkey, and smaller mammals. Everything was as it should be, and I was pleased with the data quality I was collecting. But in the 4th week, I began finding anomalies that did not fit any ecological pattern I recognized. I discovered a grove of trees approximately 2 acres in extent where every tree was dead. Not dead from disease or insect damage, but dead in a way that suggested they had all died simultaneously. The trees were still standing, their bark intact, but completely lifeless. No leaves, no signs of spring growth, just dead trees that showed no evidence of what had killed them. I collected samples for later analysis, documented the grove thoroughly, and continued my survey, puzzled but not yet alarmed. 2 days later, I found another anomaly. A circular area, approximately 50 feet in diameter, where absolutely nothing was growing. The ground was bare earth, not rocky or obviously sterile, but completely devoid of vegetation. The surrounding forest was healthy and dense, but within this circle, nothing lived. I collected soil samples, tested pH and nutrient levels, found nothing obviously wrong with the soil chemistry, but the area remained inexplicably barren. As I continued my survey work, I found more of these anomalies. Areas of simultaneous tree death, circular spaces where nothing grew, and most disturbing, areas where the forest seemed to be arranged in patterns that suggested intentional design rather than natural distribution. Trees planted in rough lines or grids, groupings of specific species that would not naturally occur in those combinations. And landscape features that seemed modified or constructed rather than naturally formed. I am a scientist, and I know that pattern recognition is a powerful human cognitive trait that sometimes leads us to see design where only randomness exists. But I could not convince myself that what I was documenting was natural. The patterns were too consistent, too deliberate. Something or someone had been modifying this forest, and the modifications appeared to be ongoing and recent. I began focusing my survey work on documenting these anomalies, photographing them extensively, taking detailed measurements, and trying to develop a hypothesis that would explain what I was observing. In the 5th week of my survey, I found something that pushed my observations into territory I had never imagined. I discovered what appeared to be a garden. Not a forest opening where native plants grew in unusual abundance, but an actual cultivated garden with species planted in rows, clearly tended and maintained. The species were all native, mostly medicinal and edible plants, but their arrangement and care indicated human or at least intelligent cultivation. I was in a wilderness area, miles from any trail or any evidence of regular human presence. Yet here was a garden that showed signs of regular maintenance and harvest. I set up a camera trap focused on the garden site, hidden carefully and set to capture any movement. If humans were cultivating this area illegally, I needed to document it. If animals were coincidentally creating patterns that resembled cultivation, I needed that documentation as well. I checked the camera after 3 days and found images that made my hands shake as I reviewed them. The camera had captured visitors to the garden. They were not human. They were large bipedal figures covered in hair, and they were clearly tending the garden. The images showed them pulling weeds, arranging stones in patterns around certain plants. And in one striking photo, one of the figures was harvesting leaves from a plant and placing them carefully in what appeared to be a woven basket. The images were clear, shot in good daylight, and showed details that were impossible to dismiss or rationalize away. I was documenting tool use and agriculture by creatures that science claims do not exist. I continued my survey with growing excitement and trepidation. I was documenting something extraordinary, something that could change our understanding of the ecology and anthropology of North American forests. But I also knew that going public with this evidence would destroy my professional credibility, would mark me as a crank or a hoaxer, and would likely end my consulting career. I faced the same dilemma that I suspect many field researchers have faced. Do you report extraordinary findings and accept the professional consequences, or do you keep silent and protect your career while knowing you have failed to document significant discoveries? I decided to continue documenting everything I could, to collect as much evidence as possible, and to make decisions about publication later. I expanded my camera trap coverage, positioning multiple cameras at different locations where I had observed anomalies. Over the next 2 weeks, I captured dozens of images and several video sequences showing these creatures moving through the forest, tending gardens, constructing what appeared to be shelters using living trees woven together, and engaging in behaviors that clearly demonstrated intelligence, culture, and a sophisticated relationship with the forest ecosystem. I also began finding evidence of their direct awareness of my presence. On several occasions, I returned to my base camp to find that items had been moved slightly. My camera equipment would be repositioned, not damaged or stolen, just moved enough to make it clear someone had examined it. Once I found a collection of stones arranged in a cairn directly in front of my tent, clearly placed there intentionally. And on another occasion, I found fresh vegetation laid out on a flat rock near my camp. Arranged carefully as if offered as a gift, medicinal herbs that I recognized, and edible mushrooms of species I'd been documenting. I began leaving my own offerings in return. Simple things. Energy bars, fresh fruit from my supplies, small tools that might be useful. These offerings were always taken, and in their place I would find return gifts. Intricate woven patterns made from grass, perfectly symmetrical arrangements of stones, or bundles of useful plants tied with plant fiber cordage. It was clear that communication was occurring, that these beings recognized me as intelligent and were engaging in reciprocal exchange. In the final week of my survey, I had a direct encounter that moved beyond indirect evidence and gift exchange. I was working on a transect in a section of dense forest when I became aware that I was being watched. I looked up from my documentation work and saw one of them standing approximately 30 feet away, partially concealed behind a large oak tree but clearly visible. We made eye contact, and for perhaps 30 seconds we simply observed each other. The being was massive, at least 7 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown hair, with a face that combined ape-like and human features in a way that was deeply striking. The eyes were intelligent, curious, and showed no fear, just interest and assessment. I spoke to it, which in retrospect seems foolish, but I am a scientist, and documentation is instinct. I identified myself, explained that I was conducting a forest survey, and thanked it for the gifts it had left at my camp. The being tilted its head slightly, a gesture that seemed remarkably human. And then it stepped fully out from behind the tree. It was holding something, and it approached closer, stopping about 15 feet from where I stood. It set the object down on the ground between us and then stepped back. The gesture was clear. Another gift, another exchange. I approached carefully and picked up what it had left. It was a woven basket, similar to the one I had seen in the camera trap images, beautifully constructed from plant fibers and containing a collection of specimens. Unusual fungi, rare plants, and several samples I did not immediately recognize. The being watched me examine the basket, and then it turned and walked away into the forest, moving with a fluid grace that was mesmerizing to watch. It did not hurry or show any concern. It simply left, the exchange completed. I completed my ecological survey with documentation of 2 parallel findings. The official report that I submitted to the Forest Service contained rigorous ecological data, documenting plant communities, wildlife sign, forest health, and recommendations for wilderness area designation. That report made no mention of gardens, constructed landscapes, or non-human intelligence. The unofficial documentation, including hundreds of photographs, video sequences, and detailed notes about my observations and the evidence of intelligent forest cultivation, remains in my private files, shared only with a small circle of trusted colleagues who are conducting similar research in other locations. The ecological evidence I documented suggests that these beings have been living in Appalachian forests for a very long time. Long enough to develop sophisticated cultivation practices and a detailed understanding of forest ecology that might exceed our own scientific knowledge. They are forest gardeners, ecosystem engineers who actively manage plant communities for their benefit while maintaining the overall health and diversity of the forest. They are indigenous in the truest sense, as much a part of the ecosystem as the trees and streams, integrated so completely that our ecological models have failed to detect their presence because we were not looking for intelligent cultivation within wilderness areas. I have continued my work as an ecological surveyor, and I approach every new project with the awareness that the forests I'm studying may contain more complexity and intelligence than I can document through standard scientific methodology. I look for the subtle signs of cultivation, for patterns that suggest intentional design, for evidence of non-human intelligence shaping ecosystems in ways that coexist with rather than dominate natural processes. And I have found that once you know what to look for, the evidence is present in many remote forest areas across the Appalachian region. We have been conducting forest surveys for decades without recognizing that we are documenting landscapes that are actively managed by beings we refuse to acknowledge exist. The wilderness designation for the area I surveyed was approved, and that watershed is now officially protected as a place where natural processes can continue without human interference. The irony is not lost on me. We are protecting these forests from human impact while remaining completely unaware of the other intelligence that has been living there successfully for millennia, maintaining ecological health through practices that our forest management could learn from if we were willing to acknowledge their existence. I do not know if anyone will believe what I am about to tell you, and I have accepted that there is no way to prove any of it beyond my word and my experience. My name is Michael Torres, and until 6 months ago, I was a wilderness therapy counselor, leading troubled teenagers on extended backpacking trips designed to help them work through behavioral issues and develop confidence and self-reliance. I loved that work, believed deeply in the transformative power of wilderness experience, and felt privileged to guide young people through some of the most difficult periods of their lives. The program I worked for operated in multiple states, conducting trips ranging from 2 weeks to 3 months in duration. The model was simple but effective. Remove teenagers from the environments and influences that were contributing to their problems. Immerse them in wilderness where survival requires cooperation and personal responsibility, and provide counseling and support while they navigate both the physical challenges of backcountry living and the emotional work of addressing their issues. It was demanding work, physically and emotionally exhausting, but seeing a teenager who had been angry and lost begin to find purpose and confidence made everything worthwhile. The trip that ended my career and changed my understanding of reality was supposed to be a standard 6-week expedition in the Great Smoky Mountains with a group of 8 teenagers, me as lead counselor and one assistant counselor named Sarah. The group was composed of kids dealing with various issues: drug problems, behavioral disorders, family conflict, and academic failure. They were tough kids from difficult circumstances, but they were also reachable, capable of growth and change if given the right environment and support. We started the trip in early September, hiking into a remote section of the Smokies where we would spend 6 weeks moving through the backcountry, learning wilderness skills, participating in group therapy sessions, and working through individual challenges. The first 2 weeks went well. The group dynamics were developing positively, the kids were responding to the program, and both Sarah and I felt confident this would be a successful trip. In the 3rd week, strange things started happening. Items would go missing from our camp during the night, small things like water bottles or bandanas. Nothing critical, but unsettling. We would hear sounds in the forest surrounding our camps, vocalizations that none of us could identify. Complex and unnerving. Several of the teenagers reported seeing figures moving through the forest at night, shadowy forms that watched our camps from the tree line. Sarah and I attributed these reports to imagination and fear, normal responses from teenagers adjusting to sleeping in the wilderness, but the incidents continued and escalated. We found our gear arranged in patterns we had not created. Sticks and stones laid out in geometric designs around our camping areas. We heard footsteps circling our camps at night, heavy, deliberate steps that did not sound like any animal we expected to encounter. And the watching intensified. All of us could feel it, that unmistakable sensation of being observed, and multiple people reported seeing large figures standing at the edge of our vision. There when you looked peripherally, but disappearing when you tried to focus on them directly. By the 4th week, the teenagers were frightened and starting to lose trust in Sarah and me to keep them safe. We held a group meeting and discussed what everyone was experiencing, validating their feelings while trying to maintain rational explanations and group cohesion. But privately, Sarah and I were also scared. We were experiencing the same things the kids were, and we had no explanation that made sense. We discussed ending the trip early and hiking out, but we were deep in the backcountry, at least 3 days from the nearest trailhead, and we worried that showing fear and uncertainty would damage the therapeutic progress the group had made. On the 28th night of the trip, everything came to a head. We were camped in a small valley, and everyone was having difficulty sleeping due to the constant sensation of being watched. Around midnight, one of the teenagers, a 16-year-old named Alex, started screaming. Sarah and I rushed to his tent and found him sitting up in his sleeping bag, eyes wide with terror, pointing at the tent wall. He was yelling that someone had touched him through the fabric, that a hand had pressed against the tent and touched his shoulder. We examined the tent and found a clear impression in the fabric, a handprint significantly larger than any human hand, pressed into the nylon as if the print had been burned or imprinted there permanently. That handprint broke whatever denial or rationalization Sarah and I had been clinging to. This was real. Something was in this forest with us, and it was making direct contact with our group. I made the decision that we were evacuating immediately, that we would hike through the night if necessary to get these kids out of this area. I began organizing the group, getting everyone up and packing their gear, preparing for a night hike. But before we could leave, They revealed themselves. Figures emerged from the forest surrounding our camp. I counted at least 9 of them, massive bipedal forms standing between 7 and 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair, with eyes that reflected our flashlight beams. They formed a rough circle around our camp, not threatening but clearly controlling our perimeter. We were surrounded, and any attempt to leave would require passing through their line. The teenagers were frozen in fear. Sarah and I were trying to project calm while feeling absolute terror, and we stood there in our campsite watching these impossible beings watch us in return. And then one of them approached. It was the largest of the group, possibly the leader, and it walked slowly toward the center of our camp, stopping perhaps 20 feet from where Sarah and I stood, with the teenagers huddled behind us. It looked at each of us in turn, its eyes intelligent and assessing, and then it did something I will never forget. It sat down on the ground, lowering itself into a sitting position, and it placed both hands palm down on the earth. The gesture was unmistakable. It was showing that it meant no harm, that it was making itself vulnerable, that it was communicating peaceful intent. Sarah and I looked at each other, and without speaking we both understood what we needed to do. I sat down, facing the being, mimicking its posture, placing my hands on the ground. Sarah did the same, and one by one the teenagers followed our lead until all 11 of us were sitting in a rough circle with this impossible creature at the center. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. And then the being stood, looked at each of us again, and walked back to join the others at the perimeter. And then all of them turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing into the darkness so completely that within seconds we could no longer see or hear them. We sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Then one of the teenagers, a girl named Maria, who had been withdrawn and non-communicative for the entire trip, spoke for the first time in weeks. She said, "They were protecting us. They've been watching over us this whole time. They were not trying to scare us. They were keeping us safe." And somehow, I knew she was right. All the watching, all the signs, all the incidents that had frightened us. They were not threats. They were guardians, beings that had been monitoring our presence in their territory and ensuring we came to no harm. We completed the trip, but everything had changed. The last 2 weeks took on a different quality. We still felt watched, but the sensation was no longer frightening. It was comforting. We occasionally saw figures at a distance, always watching, always present. And the teenagers, who had come into the wilderness angry and lost and struggling, began to heal in ways that exceeded anything Sarah and I had seen in years of wilderness therapy work. Something about that encounter, about being seen and accepted by beings that should not exist, had broken through defenses and opened space for genuine change. We hiked out at the end of week 6, and every single teenager in that group successfully completed the program and showed significant improvement in their lives after returning home. Sarah and I filed our trip reports, documenting the therapeutic outcomes but making no mention of what had actually happened in that remote valley. We knew no one would believe it, and we knew that trying to explain it would destroy our credibility and the program we believed in. But I left the wilderness therapy program 6 months ago because I could not continue doing that work without being honest about what I had experienced and what exists in those mountains. I could not keep bringing vulnerable teenagers into forests where presences I do not understand are watching and potentially interacting with us. Not because I believe they are dangerous, but because I believe we have a responsibility to acknowledge them, to respect their existence, and to approach their territory with awareness and permission rather than ignorance and presumption. I do not know what those beings are. I do not know if they are remnant populations of unknown primates, if they are something that exists between the physical and spiritual, or if they are something entirely beyond our current understanding. But I know they are intelligent. They are aware of us, and they have their own purposes and intentions that we are not privy to. I know that they were once feared by humans who encountered them, but I also know that indigenous peoples who lived in these mountains before European colonization had relationships with them, understood them as guardians and teachers, and showed them respect and reciprocity. We have forgotten that knowledge, dismissed it as superstition or mythology, and we now move through these ancient forests with no awareness of who else is present and what our presence might mean to them. We designate wilderness areas to protect them from human impact, never recognizing that they are already protected by intelligences that have maintained these ecosystems since long before our nation existed. We conduct scientific surveys and collect data about biodiversity, never acknowledging the evidence that we are not the only intelligence studying these forests. Some say it ended that night, that encounter in the Smokies, but for me, it was a beginning. I wake up now with questions instead of answers, with awareness instead of certainty, and with the understanding that the world is far stranger and more complex than we allow ourselves to believe. Thanks for listening if you made it through the darkness of these stories and stayed with me until the end. And if you are out there in the mountains, in the deep forests where the old trails lead, pay attention to the signs. Respect the presence you might feel watching you, and remember that you are a guest in territories that belong to others. Beings that have been here far longer than we have and will be here long after we are gone.